I'm a student of Peace and Conflict Studies at the University of North Carolina, Greensboro, looking through various lenses as it relates to cultural and structural violence. With all the controversy going around about Confederate monuments and the Confederate flag, in this day and time, it got me wondering what all the controversy is about. I truly wanted to know, were Confederate monuments a source of pride, prejudice, heritage, or hatred, or symbols of white supremacy, especially placed in front of courthouses and public places? I wanted to know why policy or codes that create injustice, inequality, and inequity keep cropping up for people of color, and why institutionalized racism still exists. In order to uncover the answers to my questions, I had to go back to the source and study our Civil War history, the progress of capitalism, of the antebellum South, and free labor. My intention is to create a dialogue about race relations, to transcend and help eliminate the thoughts and sentiments of the Old South. Here are my findings. Professor Elliott, what made you decide to teach Civil War, Reconstruction, and Reunion?
That's my area of expertise, which I decided when I went to graduate school in the early 1990s. And my interest in the Civil War, it's hard to explain. I think there was a lot going on with Civil War memory at the time. Ken Burns had just aired his long series on the history of the Civil War, which I was really taken with at the time. And I took a Civil War class in college, and I learned that a lot of what I had been told before I went to college was erroneous. So it was an experience to me, learning history from a different perspective and learning how much we learn about the Civil War that's not true. That kind of started me on a journey of relearning the past and relearning it this time through my own research, my own questions, my own conclusions.
Can you tell us about the history of Wyatt Outlaw, the Kirk-Holden War, and the hanging of Senator J.W. Stephens in the county courthouse in Caswell, and how this impacted Reconstruction, in particular Alamance and Caswell County?
Yes, well, those events you mentioned were really the turning point in Reconstruction in North Carolina. It was the moment when Governor William Woods Holden made up his mind that he had to take aggressive action against the Ku Klux Klan, and that action would ultimately lead to his downfall and the defeat of Reconstruction in the state. Wyatt Outlaw was a former Union soldier. He was from North Carolina. He got his name from the farm of Nancy Outlaw, where he lived. I'm not sure if he had been a slave there or not. I'm not sure that we know whether he had been enslaved. But he left and he fought for the Union and came back and became an important leader in the black community in Alamance County. He rose to important positions as head of the Union League and as, I believe he was town commissioner. And his hanging, was a direct attack on the Republicans in the state. They took one of the most talented, respected, and powerful of the black political leaders in their local area, who had been responsible for already trying to root out the Klan. He and another black leader had helped break up a Klan meeting and fired shots in the air to do that. Well, they had their revenge on him. They hung him, they kidnapped him first and then hung him from a tree outside the courthouse there in Graham, and chased off other leaders from the town. And that event caused the Holden government to declare the county in a state of insurrection. And next door in Caswell County, a similar thing happened.
Can you explain what insurrection is?
Well, The governor, according to the laws of North Carolina, and particularly the Schaffner Act, which had been passed recently, had been given the power to declare counties in state of insurrection, which is an uprising against the federal or against the local government and the state government, which meant that that would authorize him to use force to put down the insurrection.
And do you believe that William Holden's actions were necessary?
The problem with defeating the Klan within the legal system that, as it existed, is that too many people were already part of the Klan who were involved in, if not the administration of the law, the juries. You couldn't get someone convicted of a Ku Klux Klan crime because people were either afraid to convict because they would become the next victim, or they were actually part of the Klan. In the regular operation of the law, the Klan was getting away with the kinds of crimes they were undertaking, and they were becoming more and more bold. You know, they started with smaller acts of intimidation. Whipping was a big one. They would take someone and just like in under slavery, you would administer a whip, right, to punish them. They were whipping people, telling them, I don't want to see you voting, I don't want to see you coming to a Union League meeting, or whatever it was they were trying to thwart them from doing, and they would physically punish them and remind them of their condition, what their condition had been as slaves. But as they got away with those things and the law was not able to bring people to justice, they escalated. They escalated into murder and rape, arson, looting, mutilation, hanging. They ran the gambit of brutal terrorism. So in that sense, Holden had to do something. And Holden's interpretation of the law, he felt that he could not only declare martial law and stop an insurrection, but he could hold suspected terrorists without charges as long as martial law was in existence. And I think that's a legitimate interpretation of his powers. And when it was found the courts didn't agree with him, then he obeyed the courts and he released them.
And what do you believe the effects of Confederate monuments have on people of color going into the courthouses now? And also what the effects are on children when asking what that statue is about that represents white supremacy? And what do you believe should be done with Confederate monuments?
Yeah, I think that people understand these monuments put up in a time period dedicated to their subordination, are an affront. It's an affront to someone. And here we are after the Civil Rights Movement, after the whole social order of Jim Crow has been at least legally undermined and abolished. These monuments of that period still stand there, and people still look to them and declare them, to be values to emulate. And I can understand not wanting to see them anymore, and the feeling that evokes. So what to do with them? Well, the ones I have the most problem with are the ones that are on public grounds and public spaces, city squares, courthouses. These are places where the art, the memorials, the monuments in those places should reflect the values of the community. And I don't believe those are the values of the community anymore, the values of all of the community. They shouldn't be on public ground. Our government, our laws have very clearly rejected the principles they stood for. They rejected them when they fought a war against the Confederacy and defeated them. They rejected them when they rewrote the Constitution and amended it. They rejected them when the civil rights legislation came along in the 60s. So the monuments should go. Now, where should they go? That I really don't know. I don't think that any museum is obligated to take them, but private individuals are free to do what they want. So if somebody wants to construct a museum to the Confederacy and put some of these memorials there, they're free to do that. And people can pay to visit that or not pay to visit that, you know. If some wealthy person wants to create a monument park on their private land, I'd say buy up the monuments, give them a new home if that's what you think. But in those circumstances, people wouldn't be forced to go and see them. You know, that would be their choice. And they wouldn't be on public ground. They wouldn't speak for anybody but for the private owners of that lot, that museum, you know, that park.
It makes them feel that we are in a world where the past is remembered and constantly brought up. It makes people feel that they are not a part of today's society, where we have moved past a history that brings nothing but shame to people. I think it makes us want to not do the kinds of things that we need to do if we want to better this country. When you talk about bringing America back or making America great again, a lot of times people forget that that wasn't greatness for everybody. I believe these monuments affect a lot of people in a negative way, and in particular African Americans, because it's a constant reminder of some of the atrocities that have been done by the government, by our laws, by our customs that have affected African Americans so negatively. It's the kind of thing that we want to move away from, and we don't want to be reminded of it in any kind of a positive way. So the idea is to look forward with what we want this country to be, and not necessarily look back with fond remembrance or based on what it has done in the past. Of course, it has a psychological effect. It makes people think that justice isn't going to necessarily be fair. It makes them think that justice is going to be swayed towards a particular point of view. And it doesn't make people feel good about what the U.S. criminal code system is supposed to be about. It represents unfairness rather than fairness.
Essentially, it's an intimidation tactic. It's an intimidation tactic all day. If you look at the time frames in which monuments were erected across the U.S., you have a story where basically right after the Civil War ended, you didn't have any monuments going up. But then as soon as Jim Crow came and people were fighting against that, you see a rise in monuments all of a sudden. And then you see it die down again. And then when the 60s and 70s civil rights movement comes along, you see a whole bunch of Confederate flags getting sold. There's more black people locked up right now than were ever enslaved. Like right now, there's more of us in there working for free, or like 17 cents a day or something of that nature, to make everything. They do your customer service, they make your car parts, they make your food. It's not just license plates like they show you on TV. They are literally working to mass produce things for us. And then on the flip side, when they get out, they can't get hired. They can't get a job. You were perfectly good to work as long as you're working for us for free. It's just like
well, our country has shown you, again, the fruits of that poisonous tree. We have, if you just, in a capitalistic society, you can tell what the people, well not the people, but what the government values based on where the money is spent. So we'll spend about $8,000 per student in school to educate them, but then on the flip side, we'll spend $125,000 per prisoner to keep them incarcerated. So that's where our priorities are, and you got to think, who benefits from those government contracts?
Right.
Who benefits from that private prison system? Who benefits from keeping your kids dumb and have them not knowing your history? We in America don't like to have the conversation about the actual real principles of what our country was founded on.
Mm-hmm.
And it was white supremacy, it was violent, and it was racism, and basically dehumanizing whole groups of people because they didn't fit into a white European mold. So that is the roots that our country's tree is planted in. I guess if that makes sense, if I explain that right. But that's the roots of our country. So the way that happens over time, or the way that it manifests over time, is when you have teachers who aren't teaching about true black history and the history of folks in this country, when you have police officers that aren't treating people of color as they are, you know, like they're human beings, or like they're equal to other white folks, or even with classism, it's to, you know, make sure I'm saying this right. But all of those are fruits of that poisonous tree. So we try to pluck off the fruit from that tree, but it keeps coming back. It keeps manifesting. But that's what our country's history is. So until we actually go back and dismantle and pull up those roots that our country was founded on, we can't end racism. We can't end these perpetual cycles of what's going on, because we haven't actually addressed the real root causes of what those are. And that's what our country has been founded on. So when we start talking about immigration and things as well, when you look at Europe, they weren't sending their best and their brightest. When we look at the talent and things and people that we're pulling from Africa, we're pulling real talent. We're pulling doctors, attorneys, athletes. We're pulling real talent from these countries. But yet they're from shithole countries.
I do strongly believe that Confederate statues, any type of monuments that proclaim these people to be heroes or some type of saviors outside of courthouses do affect African Americans adversely before entering this establishment. I think one of the main reasons is it reminds African Americans of a period of bondage, and going into a facility that is supposed to, by example, by the Constitution, supposed to be where the law is resolved. And knowing the history of policing in this country, knowing how the law was established was to keep African Americans down. And then you have these symbols that celebrate it. And, you know, Lady Justice is supposed to be blind. She doesn't supposed to see color. She also carries these things that measure weight. And everyone's supposed to start off on an even playing field. And I think with signs and monuments like that hold people whose main job, whose main ideology, and all their life proclaimed and talked about inequality, bondage of a certain race, and thought that they were inferior. And having that outside of a place that is supposed to be blind, and everyone is supposed to start off on an even playing field, I think that is adversely affecting African Americans even before going into the courthouse. As someone's family who's gone through, you know, civil rights, who was around during the days of Dr. King and Malcolm X, both down south and up north, I don't care about it. But as a millennial, as my parents call me, I see it all the time around me. I went to a rural high school in North Carolina where a lot of my friends, people who I grew up with, flew this flag, had it on the back of their trucks, took a lot of pride in it, had it on their hats and everything, with the fishing hook on it as well. But what I've always thought about this flag is that it represents a seceded nation, one that gave up on the core principles of America, finding ways to fix our issues through the democratic process, finding ways to fix our issues by coming together. And, you know, one of the core principles of America is that, you know, we live up to our word and our bond. Our bond is everything, as you always hear. And when it comes to the Confederacy, those who decided to secede, you know, time and time again, you saw the American government try to reach compromises. Hopefully what we could do was compress slavery. Hopefully what we could do that hopefully over the years it would die out, and that we reach these agreements with the Confederate government that it would go away. Time and time again, the Confederacy said, well, you know, let's extend it. You know, let's go a little bit further. Let's not get there yet. We're not at that point yet. And it's funny to see this. And so when you're talking to people about the Confederate flag, you know, the first thing that you see is, you know, it's my culture. It's my history. You know, you don't see folks in Germany flying the Nazi flag. You don't see monuments up that celebrate concentration camps that killed millions of Jewish people. And one of the funny things is when you have this conversation with people, they talk about, well, no, this wasn't a treasonous country. They stood up for their values. But those are the same people who damn Colin Kaepernick for kneeling down because he doesn't believe in what America is doing right now. It's very funny. One of the stories that, people say you kneel at a game because you see something that's hurt. Well, Colin Kaepernick is kneeling because he seems as if he's in a hurt nation. They call him all these names. But as soon as you say something about those people who fly that Confederate flag, the first thing they like to jump on, that's my First Amendment right. You shouldn't be jumping on me about using my constitutional right to express how I feel. I feel like the Confederate flag has absolutely no place in America. And if you were to do your history on the Confederate flag, you would know even the person who had designed it said it represents white power. It represents superiority over all races. And I think that's what's most important. So have your history together about what you're flying over your house. Have your history together about what you have in your car. Have your history together about what you put on your head. I think that's most important. I'll reiterate this point, is that having Confederate monuments and statues out in front of public buildings is definitely not a good sign for our country. But what I do strongly also believe is that they definitely should not be in schools. That's the last resort. I've always been taught that you're not born hating people. It's something that you're taught. It's something that you learn. And having that outside of a place of learning where we're supposed to educate the future of America, supposed to be building the brightest minds, the next Stephen Hawking, the next Albert Einstein, that is what we're supposed to do. We shouldn't be out here trying to build the next Robert E. Lee, the next Braxton Bragg. That's not what we should be doing as a country. So having these symbols of hate outside of these places of learning definitely do something to the subconscious of a student. And it makes it seem like, well, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. It's just the same story that you hear during the Civil Rights Movement. It's like when you see something so constantly, you think it's right. That's why Jim Crow just didn't go away. He had sons. He had Jane and he had James Crow, Esquire. And the giants are going to keep coming. It's time that we knock down this part of our history. We have to learn from it, as I've already said. But the main part about it is that we must give our children a start that we did not have. And that's eliminating that from public schools.
Open wide, each one sad.